Welcome into the Blanco Show, presented by Barrio Tacos. Tyler Danburg alongside Kole Emplit, Caleb Spinner, and Chloe Trapanotto. And we are ahead, just a couple days away from Week 3's matchup here in Columbus between the Toledo Rockets and the number 3 Ohio State Buckeyes. And both teams come into this matchup, two interstate foes, and they also happen to be 2-0 after what was a wild weekend in college football last week.
Yeah, absolutely. You saw teams that shouldn't have lost lose. You saw teams that shouldn't have won win. And that's the nature of this game. That's the nature of the beast. It's an entirely different animal each and every weekend. And this was something, of course, Texas A&M was a huge one there. But yeah, this was an entertaining week to come in off of from college football.
And Alabama survived a scare against Texas, and that allowed them to drop in the AP Top 25 polls. They go down to number 2. Georgia slides up to number 1, and as a result, Ohio State goes to number 3. Now, after Ohio State beat Arkansas State, we'll have more on that in just a couple of moments. Cole, was it right for Alabama to stay ahead of Ohio State in the polls?
Listen, I definitely think so. They go into Austin, a very hostile environment, and yes, they struggled very early on, and they let Texas be in that game the entire fourth quarter, but they were able to pull out, and I just think the reason why they should stay ahead of Ohio State is just the result as well. Seeing Ohio State beat Arkansas State, but especially with Notre Dame falling as well, I think they really took to that in the poll and saying, hey, we still value Alabama's wins ahead of Ohio State because of it.
And for Ohio State, they beat the Arkansas State Red Wolves despite a relatively slow start, but they handled them 45-12, the final score. And Chloe, it was all about Marvin Harrison Jr. in the end with his 3-touchdown performance.
It was. He did an excellent job. I mean, he almost had 4. That was almost a 4th touchdown pass. And in fact, we've only seen 2 wide receivers in program history to have multiple games with at least 3 touchdown catches, the other one being Joey Galloway. So it was great to see Marvin Harrison Jr. coming back and playing another game with 3 touchdowns, aside from the Rose Bowl that we saw last year.
C.J. Stroud led the way passing. He had over 350 yards and 4 touchdowns. But then defensively, the Jim Knowles defense continues to hold true, and Steel Chambers led that defensive unit with 6 tackles and a sack. We're continuing to see a lot more defensive performances from this Ohio State team, which is great to see.
Yeah, we are, but I think one of the biggest things that you take away from that Arkansas State game was Denzel Burke in the secondary. There were a few instances where he let up, whether it was his fault, whether he was fooled by the route, whatever it may be, whatever that reason is. We were talking at media availability yesterday to some of those members of the defensive secondary, and they said that has been a focus. Those routes on the outside, making sure they're staying with receivers, coming over in their man coverages, coming over in their zone coverages, making sure they're all on the same page in that. And I think you're going to see a new and improved force in the secondary this weekend.
Caleb, what I liked also was Jim Knowles' comment in the media day. He said, those cornerbacks are on an island. Like, they're doing something that a lot of Americans simply cannot at all ever even dream of doing. So there are a lot of his players and him himself were just saying, you know what, give Denzel Burke some credit. We're going to let him settle down a little bit. Everybody has their moments. I'm excited to see him this week come back and really run that corner.
And also, Lathan Ransom, another guy that spoke about Denzel Burke, said he's not worried. He said that Denzel Burke is a baller. There's a reason why he was one of the top freshman defensive backs and one of the top defensive backs in all of the country last year. But this Ohio State defense, they're going to face a running unit that scored 6 touchdowns last week in the 55-10 rout of the UMass Minutemen, and quarterback Daquan Finn also had a great week too. He's at a great start of the season, and he's a different dual threat quarterback that Ohio State hasn't seen yet this year.
I think you hit exactly on that. This is Ohio State's first time to see, like you mentioned, a dual threat quarterback, a very mobile quarterback that they could see down the line the Big Ten season. Like you talked about, he's the top passing and rushing threat for Toledo. He's pretty much their entire offense. He's 33 for 54, 393 yards with 3 touchdowns on the ground and in the air. I'm going to be very interested to see how Jim Knowles wants to approach this, maybe put a spy on him constantly, as you never know where he's going to be.
And for Finn, Jim Knowles said that they're going to have to focus on the fact that the runs that Toledo draws up for him, they're not designed. A lot of that is based off of improvisation because Toledo, that offensive line is one of the weaknesses. So trying to stop Finn while he's coming up with those runs on the fly, that's going to be a crucial key in this matchup.
It definitely will, and that's just the game when you're playing an option quarterback. If you can take away his ability to run the ball, you have to force him to throw through the air. And like we've seen so far, he hasn't done the greatest job at that, especially going against now one of the top defenses that we've seen so far this season in Ohio State.
And we're talking about this Week 3 matchup between the Toledo Rockets and the third-ranked Ohio State Buckeyes here on the Block O Show, presented by Barrio Tacos. The Rockets and the Buckeyes squaring off this Saturday at 7 p.m. on Fox and also on Scarlet and Gray Sports Radio, as well as Scarlet and Gray Sports Radio TV. Ohio State leads the all-time series 3-0, but the last time these two teams met, you got to go all the way back over a decade, and in fact, that was one that Toledo went late in the third quarter and was still leading 22-21 before they turned it over on downs, trying to make a game-winning drive. The Rockets always play teams of Ohio State's caliber. They play them tough. They've played Michigan tough in the past. They almost beat Notre Dame last year, and they almost beat Ohio State in 2011. For Ohio State, how do you try and stop a hungry team like Toledo and try and avoid that upset alert?
Well, you fight fire with fire, right? And you've got to be a hungry team too. Just because there's such a gap between an unranked team and a number 3 team doesn't mean you can just afford to coast. Put yourself on cruise control and roll through the week going into next weekend against Wisconsin. You have to play the team that Toledo knows you're capable of being, that you know you're capable of being, and that your fans know that you're capable of being. These are the weeks where, you can look at this as a practice if you want to, like we saw with Arkansas State, not playing Jackson Smith-Njigba, Julian Fleming, getting some of the reserves in there to get their confidence up. You can look at it like that, but everybody has to be full speed ahead in this game, and the same applies for Toledo. This is going to be one of your biggest challenges, if not the biggest challenge of the season for you. You've got to play like to the caliber of your opponent if you're Toledo going to Ohio State.
You mentioned Jackson Smith-Njigba and Julian Fleming, two of Ohio State's wide receivers that are expected to return. Fleming hasn't played this year. Smith-Njigba got hurt early on in Week 1 against Notre Dame. So, Chloe, you focused early on in the show on Marvin Harrison Jr., but what might we expect the roles to look like for Smith-Njigba and then Julian Fleming making his season debut?
With them back, the whole game is going to change. I mean, obviously, we had 2 wide receivers that were freshmen that had to step in and do a very good job, but now that we've got kind of the more experienced players back, this team is kind of unstoppable. It's kind of very impressive to me to see the depth that we have, not just in the offense, but now even with this new defense. I mean, now we're blitzing, we're doing a ton of new things on defense. There's depth there, depth in the offense. I mean, I think those 2 players are going to be excellent. I'm excited.
It's been that next man up mentality all year long in the first 2 weeks for Ohio State, and a testament to the depth that you mentioned, especially at the wide receiver position. And you would have to assume Emeka Egbuka, Xavier Johnson, 2 guys that might see their roles decrease a little bit because of Fleming and JSN being back in the lineup. But with the way they've played the first 2 weeks, you'd have to assume they're going to still see a lot of snaps.
Oh, and I think you hit on that perfectly. They've been phenomenal through their first 2 games. Adding Smith-Njigba, adding Julian Fleming to the mix, it definitely takes the attention off of them. You're going to put your best player on Jack Smith-Njigba the entire game. And while, Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka might not get as many touches, they're definitely going to get more opportunities and, even better looks now for that home run play that they haven't really been able to get through their first 2 games.
Let's go around the table now. We'll start off with you, Kole, and work our way around. Keys to this game for Ohio State. What do they need to do to win?
Looking offensively, it's never a problem when you look at Ohio State's offense. Like we talked about, like Chloe mentioned, they are so deep, especially in that wide receiver room. They can throw anybody at you, and they're going to really hurt you. It's just more looking at the defense. The defense who's been phenomenal under Jim Knowles these past 2 games. But something that some of the players mentioned, Tanner McAllister especially, said Jim Knowles wants to see a turnover. And I feel like if Ohio State can start creating turnovers and really get that pressure going, they're going to run away with this game really quickly.
Well, I got to focus on the offense then. If Cole's going to start on defense, I got to flip the script for it. I think you got to balance the running and the receiving. Like we know by this time, especially with the performances last week, not saying the running didn't do a good job, but the specific focus was on Marvin Harrison Jr. You saw Xavier Johnson get in a little bit, Emeka Egbuka as well in there as well. But this has to be a dual threat offense. You have to make sure that the running game is just as feared, whether it's Mayan Williamson or Trayvon Henderson. You have to make sure that they are just as scary a threat for opposing defenses coming in as the receivers are. So look for there to be a balance between those rushing and those receiving.
Yeah, speaking of those opposing defenses, I mean, we have Dallas Gant, who was a player at Ohio State. He played for the Buckeyes for 3 years, I believe, before transferring to his hometown of Toledo. So I'm excited to see that defense ran by him. I think he had, 20 tackles, and he's leading the scores with tackles for their team. So their defense up against our phenomenal offense is going to be a very interesting matchup, which I'm excited for.
Toledo's a talented team, a talented defense. Jamal Hines is another guy coming off the edge. It's going to be a really interesting matchup to see the Toledo edge rusher go up against Paris Johnson Jr., the left tackle for Ohio State, because those two guys were teammates at Cincinnati Princeton High School. So that'll be a fun matchup to watch those two go at it, because Hines, preseason All-MAC and a preseason Bednarik Watch List Award honor type of player, because he's one of the top defenders in the conference, and you can make the argument that he's one of the better ones in the country. You mentioned the defense forcing turnovers. Ohio State defensively, they've yet to do that. Perhaps we can see that coming up Saturday night at 7 o'clock on Fox and Scarlet and Gray Sports Radio. And now a word from our sponsors, Barrio Tacos.
Barrio Tacos is coming to the Ohio State campus. Located at 15th and High at Gateway to the University, Barrio Tacos' long-awaited grand opening was Tuesday, September 13th at 3 p.m. Everyone that day received one free taco, and the first 50 people in line received free queso for a year. And I don't know about you guys, but that line was around the corner. Everyone wanted to try to get on that free queso. Everyone wanted to get that one free taco. You can also catch the Barrio Tacos inside the shoe during game days at Section 10A and at their taco truck Mondays to Fridays, parked right outside the RPAC.
You know, they talk about living a good life. I don't mean to cut you off here, Chloe, but they talk about living a good life as living one with no regrets. My one regret in life is not being able to attend that grand opening and get that free queso.
Listen, I mean, if you wanted to get that free queso, you were waking up at 7 a.m. to camp out on a 50-degree Ohioan day, but I work there, so I can get you guys free queso anytime you want.
We got the inside rep
regardless.
here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also interesting, too, because you know that people are camping out and they really want that queso when Brutus shows up and starts providing some entertainment, because, especially like you said, it was chilly, surprisingly chilly. There was a gleam in the air and maybe a little bit of a whiff of some tacos in the air as well. Now let's get into some score predictions. Starting off with you, Chloe, what do you have prediction-wise for this matchup?
All right, well, over the past couple weeks, I think people have been expecting the Buckeyes to get a ton of points on the board and just completely knock out their opponents. I'm thinking Toledo might be the hardest opponent we play so far. I'm going to say 38-17 Buckeyes.
Wow. Hardest opponent we've played so far.
That's my take.
That's a strong take, and I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that's a strong take here. I personally look at the 32, and I like that gap. I'm not quite at that margin, but I like that margin of victory. I have 52-17 Ohio State. I think I'm going to go out on a limb. Here, Chloe went out on a limb. I'll go out on one, too. I'm going to say a majority of Toledo's 17 come in the second half when Ohio State starts to put in the reserves. And by contrast, for Ohio State to be putting in the reserves in the third quarter, late third quarter, early fourth quarter, that means Ohio State will have had at least a 3-touchdown lead by halftime on the Rockets. So that's where I'll stick my neck out.
I like those first two. Toledo's defense right now, they come into this game holding opponents to 2.8 yards per play. That's the lowest average in the nation. Ohio State's offense averaging over 7.5. That's one of the top marks in the Big Ten. But not only do they get their two wide receivers back, but they're going to come out looking to try and build off of the first 2 weeks' success. But however, Toledo's no slouch. They've got a lot of talent and they have transfers from Power 5 schools that have had experience against Ohio State. You mentioned Dallas Gant. He's got experience at Ohio State. But running back Penny Boone, for example, he ran for over 40 yards last year on October 9th in the Horseshoe for Maryland. So he's no stranger to the location as well. But I have Ohio State winning 45-20.
I think you guys have all made some great points, but specifically you, Tyler, bringing back Jackson Smith and Jigba and bringing back Julian Fleming, while I think that they're going to really get them involved and start to run up the score a little bit, they're going to still adjust to this new offense as well, let them get into a flow of things. Because of that, I still think they're going to score some points, but similar to Arkansas State, I think Toledo is a really strong, gritty team. I think they're going to move the ball well in the first half, get some field goals here and there, but in the end, I think Ohio State's going to win 48-17, just under that 32 spread.
If you all had to pick a breakout player, a breakout star for Ohio State in this game. Last week, you can make the argument that it was the true freshman, Caden Curry, making the most out of the final 10 snaps of the game. But if you had to pick that one Buckeye to really excel, who might it be?
Well, I took the offensive focus when you were talking about keys of the game, so I'm going to switch to defense here. I'm going to say it's Denzel Burke. I'm going to say he gets revenge. I'm going to say he's sitting right now in his apartment, probably at the Griff, just listening to all the negatives go around about how bad he was in the last performance, about how he's a no-good player in the secondary, how he's going to be second string by the end of this week. I'm thinking all that noise is circling around in his head, building up, and this is the game where he really gets to let it out. So I'm going to go with Denzel Burke.
And Mika Ibuka, I watched his tape yesterday. He seems excited. He seems fresh. I'm excited to see what he does with the ball.
Caleb, I'll follow along with you. I want to see another defensive player really shine. I want to see Jack Sawyer shine. He only has 2 tackles so far this year, and as a true freshman last year, he had 3 sacks and 13 tackles. I really want to see him have his coming out game this sophomore year, especially against Toledo. Give him a chance to really shine a little bit.
I like that one.
The other big thing about Jack Sawyer, too, at Media Day was he talked about potentially transitioning from Jack to Leo, which I thought could be a really interesting setup for the defense here. We'll see what that looks like. But I love the defensive line side of things. So as soon as he said that, I just got giddy.
You're a former defensive lineman yourself. But for
don't
those
do
that
that.
don't know, Caleb loves the Leo and the Jack end position. So this is not a surprise.
1, 3, 5 tech defensive tackles. I eat it up.
I'll go to the offensive side as well, and I'll stay similar to your track, Chloe. But I'll go to the tight ends. Cade Stover pulled in 5 catches against Arkansas State. The tight end room for me has been really fascinating. Perhaps we can see some more snaps for another tight end in G. Scott Jr. Maybe Joe Royer gets into the mix just like he did in the spring game. But I'm going to say Cade Stover will be the breakout Buckeye for me. So I think we've all got some prone breakout performances here on the Block O Show presented by Barrio Tacos. And that's where we'll wrap up. For Chloe Trapanotto, for Caleb Spinner, Kole Emplit, I'm Tyler Danburg signing off. We will see you on the call on Scarlet and Gray Sports Radio and SGSR TV 7 p.m. Saturday night as Toledo takes on number 3 Ohio State.